They hammer with swords and guns and smartphones and double-digit growth at the doors of the beefeaters, the environmentalists, the university students, the feminists, the Dalits, the leftists, the dissenting writers, the skeptics, the anti-nationals, anyone who will not declare, both fists clenched, Bharat Mata ki jai.
Hello and welcome to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal Southasian, where we speak to celebrated authors and emerging literary voices from across South Asia. Today is Tuesday, the 11th of June. I'm your host, Shwetha Srikanthan, assistant editor at Himal Southasian, coming to you from Colombo, and here with us today is Siddhartha Deb, joining us from New York to talk about his novel The Light at the End of the World and his latest book, Twilight Prisoners, The Rise of the Hindu Right and the Fall of India. Born in Shillong in northeastern India, Siddhartha Deb is a renowned novelist and journalist based in Harlem. He is the author of 2 previous novels, The Point of Return and An Outline of the Republic, and a work of narrative journalism titled The Beautiful and the Damned. His journalism and essays have appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, The New Republic, Dissent, The Baffler, Caravan, and more. The Light at the End of the World, Siddhartha Deb's first novel in 15 years, reinvents South Asian fiction for our time. Set in a dystopian future of authoritarianism and climate disaster, the novel blurs the line between realism and speculative fiction. It captures the puzzle of contradictions that is modern India today, and traces it back to the many moments of apocalypse in the subcontinent's history. At its core, the novel is also about how certain tragedies and certain kinds of violence are repeated. Now, over the past decade and a half, India has pivoted from a seeming success story, revealing itself to be a stranger-than-fiction dystopia today. In his recently published Twilight Prisoners, Siddhartha paints a damning picture of these darkest turns in India's recent past. It is a powerful exploration of the rise of Hindu nationalism and its impact on dissenting voices and marginalized communities. And most importantly, it's a timely reminder that those who resisted and are resisting today, India's Twilight Prisoners, if you will, are not forgotten. As long as there is resistance and remembrance, there is still hope. Siddhartha, welcome to the Southasia Review of Books podcast, and thank you so much for joining us to talk about your brilliant new books.
Hi, Shweta. I'm delighted to be talking to you and to your listeners. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be speaking to someone from the subcontinent, to be speaking to someone from home, in some sense.
So, in the first chapter of Twilight Prisoners, you write about, and I'll quote a section, the astonishing and amazing phenomenon of a world that can still produce, from the crushed bottom layers of Indian society, people who, with every bit of the dignity and courage they can muster, resist the lure of their silent, lonely, aloof, admired, and unloved leader. As a new era begins in Indian politics, what are your reflections on the 2024 election outcomes of Modi and his Bharatiya Janata Party failing to win a majority? What does this signal for the new India? Does it signal hope, or will Hindu nationalism bide its time again?
Thanks, Shweta. That is a great question. I mean, in brief, I think the election results are fantastic in some sense. It shows the decline of the appeal of the Hindu nationalist project. When I wrote that passage, though, just to put it in context, it was in an essay that was published in 2016, and it was an essay on Narendra Modi, and it was it's over a 10,000-word piece. It was for the New Republic magazine. This was just shortly after the Hindu rights' first major victory in 2014. And it was written against the backdrop of utter silence, not just in India, but also in the West. Not just utter silence, but incredible praise for Modi's Hindu right project among the Indian elites, among the Indian liberal class, not just the Indian Hindu nationalists, but the Indian liberal class, among the Western media, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Guardian. I mean, and there have been, as again I talk about in my book, I think apart from Pankaj Mishra and Arundhati Roy, almost no other Indian writer, elite writer with access to these kind of publications raised their voice. And the Western journalists, the Western interpreters, the Western talking heads were just as culpable. They talked about Modi as part of this new dynamic in India. And so this essay was written in a moment of despair. and it was written in a moment of anger. It's not an essay I even wanted to write. But I had just been made the contributing editor to the New Republic, and they said, do you want to write? And I was working on my novel. I didn't want to take a break from the novel to really go into this sort of dark history of the Hindu right. But I just felt like no one is doing it. The only existing profile in the Western media at that point was a profile in the Atlantic Monthly by Robert Kaplan, when Modi was still chief minister of Gujarat, and it was a very admiring profile. It was like, well, there are certain things he does which are a bit troublesome, but that's what you need to make India a Singapore. So it was written against that. It was again written against the context of Rohit Vemula's suicide. It was written against the context of the incredible violence against people in India raising any kind of protest, any kind of voice. But I think in these protests we did see that it wasn't the Indian elite. It was really like I said, the crushed bottom layers of Indian society where you could see some kind of resistance. And now, almost a decade later, that has become much more visible. And we see that in the pattern of the voting as well, that it's often in areas where people are especially deprived, where people have voted against the Hindu right, against the BJP. I'm particularly taking great pleasure from the fact that they lost Ayodhya, because again, I was in Ayodhya a few years ago to watch the construction of the Ram Temple. I saw the kind of, I write about it extensively in this book. And so there's a particular kind of pleasure that that's their sort of their grand sort of symbolic project, and they have lost there. So I think it is the beginning of a kind of hope. And given the state of the world, I mean, it's not, that doesn't mean that this is going to be easy. Doesn't mean that, the Hindu right is just going to roll over. That doesn't mean the hatred is going to go away. But yeah, I do see a sign of hope, and I think we are at a moment of history all over the world where we really desperately need hope. And so when we get it, we must embrace it. We must take pleasure from it. We must have joy in it.
Thank you for that. We absolutely must embrace that. So, as a non-fiction writer, you've written on India's inequalities and Hindu nationalism for years, aspects that you revisit in the light at the end of the word too. So could you tell us about how the different pieces presented in Twilight Prisoners are in conversation with your novel? What does fiction allow you to do that non-fiction doesn't?
Oh, I love that question. I mean, it's a great question. And my non-fiction is very straightforward, matter of fact. It's very based on research and reporting and facts, I was trained as a journalist. I didn't. It's a weird thing to say, but I feel like a person from the 20th century, which I am. But I didn't really learn. I didn't really take a course in any of these things, in journalism or creative writing or essay writing. I couldn't afford to, and they didn't really exist in India at the time. And I learned journalism by working in newspapers and magazines, and I learned writing fiction by reading books. But my training as a journalist was I started in daily newspapers, and before I went into magazine long-form reporting. But facts and the truth aren't the same thing. They are connected to each other. There are areas into which I can't go in nonfiction. I can't go into another character's mind, for instance. I don't do that. There are certain nonfiction writers who do that. I don't do that. It's not something I'm comfortable with. I can only go into my own mind as the reporter, and I do, and I tell the reader that. But I can't go into the minds of other characters. I can't go into other bodies. There are often questions nowadays. I think these are good questions. Is that appropriation? Should you be doing it? I think these are excellent questions. But, the light at the end of the world, the main character is kind of a journalist, but it's a woman. And there are many other aspects of her identity which I do not share. But there are certain aspects of identity which I do share, actually, and that's what fiction allows me to do. Allows me to go into that realm. But beyond that, and of course, Bibi is a journalist, but she stops being a journalist long when we begin her story. At the very open the novel, we see that she has just stopped. She's living a kind of failed life. And the question is always why. And I am very attracted to those questions. I'm attracted to the questions of what does it mean to be a failure? What does it mean to feel like you're a failure deep down? What does it mean to feel like you live in a world that has failed? It's not just you that have failed, because Bibi is a very perceptive person. So it's not just that she's failed. She's also in a city that has failed, in a country that has failed, in a world that has failed, right? So I think these are really big, grand questions on the one hand. And on the other hand, they are tackled in this sort of intimate, sort of granular way from inside a character. It's what fiction allows. Fiction allows me to go really micro, really granular, and it also allows me to go really wide and sweeping and panoramic. Nonfiction is like for the middle ground, and I love both. They complement each other, and the nonfiction kind of haunts the fiction. So a lot of my nonfiction writing haunts. There's a lot of things that I couldn't cover in my pieces. There are, aspects of pain, emotions, rumors, weird. Amit Basha, who's one of the most perceptive commentators on my fiction, he's a professor at Oklahoma University. He's from the Northeast India as well. And he's picked up on this very well, that my novel is very interested in the weird. And in that sense, it's a departure from realism. So nonfiction is very realist, it's almost realist, because even in nonfiction, I am quite influenced by, I talked a lot about journalism and facts, but I'm also very influenced by the Latin American chronica tradition. So someone like Garcia Marquez is a great influence to me, because he's also always a journalist. So people know Garcia Marquez's novels and his magical realism novels, but he also did very, very solid reporting and nonfiction pieces, like the story of a shipwrecked sailor. But Latin American writing has always blurred the lines between fiction and nonfiction, between realism and magic realism, and that's in the chronica tradition. And that's a little of an influence in my nonfiction as well. But fiction, I can go all out. I can go into the past, I can go into the deep past, I can go into history, but I can go into it in imaginative, speculative ways, rather than just to the terrain of the textbook and the research fact. So they are very complementary, and they seem to appeal to different sides of my personality. One side of my personality is very, very organized, and that's the part that maybe goes to the nonfiction. And the other side is much more speculative, much more weird, much more mystical. And the fiction allows me to indulge that.
Thank you. And I really enjoyed reading both the books side by side. I think they complement each other so well. So let's talk about influences and genres a bit more. The novelist Karan Mahajan, for instance, describes The Light at the End of the World as a new kind of subcontinental novel. Tell us about writing a novel that blurs the line between real and speculative, particularly in thinking about dystopian futures of climate crisis, authoritarianism, and the chokeholds of various corporate military overlords in India and beyond.
Oh, that's a great question. And Karan was just so generous with the blurb. I mean, I have to say that, when I mention the names of people, generosity is it's a rare quality in our world. And so Karan was willing to blurb the novel at a time when I actually had a very hard time finding a publisher for this novel, because it's just so different, and particularly in the West, they didn't really like it. They found it too, I don't know. So I had a lot of difficulty, and Karan stepped in at that moment, and I think he read it. He said, he and his wife had a baby. So he said, it's a really big book. I may not be able to read all of it, but I'll definitely give you a blurb. But then he would read like a portion. He would read a section every week, and every week he would send me an email. So he did that for like 5 weeks. So he sent me like 5 blurbs, basically. And every week he was email saying, I just finished this and I'm so excited. I don't know what you're doing. But yeah, it's a departure. And partly of the reason was that, I have worked in the realist vein myself with my first and second novels, especially, both of them stay pretty close to the terrain of realism. And there are ways in which I love realism. But it was basically as I was reporting in Modi's India, or as I was living in the world, I began to feel that for me, realism was just an inadequate sort of frame to capture the ghastliness, the unreality, the weirdness of the kind of things we were seeing, whether that was about the right everywhere, and not just Modi. We have to remember the right here too, Trump here. It's very, very hard for me to see, for instance, what is happening in Gaza today. And it's on the one hand, it's ghastly, realist, and graphic. It's a reality. On the other hand, it's like, did somebody make up this story that there is just this horrible, endless, one-sided slaughter going on, and it is happening in full view, and nobody talks about it? And in America, in New York, nobody allowed to talk about it, you know? So in India, it was very similar. Like nobody talked about Modi, right? And nobody talked about it. I got disinvited to family weddings. It's just fascinating. People told me that don't come if you're going to you leave your writer self behind if you come, because we don't want you to come and start talking about how terrible Modi is. I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't go to the wedding. It's very sad, but I had friends and family. Now the same people will say, "Oh, congratulations on your book, on your prize." So I felt a certain weirdness, but also climate change, climate collapse, the kind of things that were happening, just the dust storms, the sand, the cyclones, the pollution in Delhi, which people in Delhi don't really talk about it because, in some sense, we are trained to not talk about many things, and not just in India, everywhere. In New York, we are trained not to talk about Palestine. In India, we are trained not to talk about Kashmir. We are trained to not talk about so many things, about the pollution, and I felt that realism was just an inadequate sort of frame to capture these things for me. And I really wanted to, I became interested in the idea that what if one were to treat a dust storm as an alive thing, a cyclone as an alive thing, which, as we know, and, among other people, Amitabh Ghosh has written about it in his essays that, realism has struggled to deal with climate change because it is so attached to the bourgeois and the rational world that it comes from, colonial, bourgeois, Western, masculine world. But all pre-existing traditions before that, literary artistic traditions, have always made rooms for the enchanted, for the uncanny, for the magic. Right. And for me, stepping away from realism into the realm of speculative fiction was a way of tackling things like, sectarian violence and climate change. And I'm also very influenced by the writers I read. So on the one hand, I love realism. I love 19th century French realism, for instance, but I also read, I have very wide taste. I read a lot of genre. I love Afrofuturism. It has always been a huge influence on me. Before, again, like Black Lives Matter made it like big in the US mainstream. But, I've been reading, Octavia Butler long before Octavia Butler re-emerged the mainstream. So again, Afrofuturism, for Afrofuturism, it is a way to make sense of slavery and Jim Crow. And these are actual historical, factual processes of violence. But the experience of them, even Toni Morrison's Beloved, takes from the Gothic, takes from, in some sense, quote unquote, magic realism, because it's one of the ways to make, for her as a writer, to grapple with the horror of slavery and the violence that it just imparts upon generations. So I have lived in America for over 25 years, and I'm very grateful that I'm in, like I said, I'm very influenced by Latin American magic realism, but I'm also influenced by a certain Afro-American Afrofuturism. And then in India, I grew up reading a lot of ghost stories, like I think a lot of South Asian children used to. I don't know if they still do. I think they do. So it's a part of our fabric. And ghost stories are, again, a way of actually commenting on the real. Bengal had this, again, this is not an original thought. Again, I think Ghosh, writes about it first. But Bengal had an outpouring of ghost stories in the early 20th century. And they were ways of talking about colonialism. They were coded ways of talking about colonialism, coded ways of talking about famine. And you don't realize it as a child, but then when you grow up, you see, yeah, there are a lot of empty, abandoned villages in these stories. And this traveler finds this one woman who is alive in the middle of a village where there's nobody. And she is kind of beautiful, but she's also strange. And then he, falls in love with her, brings her home, and then strange things happen. It's a great story. But why are all these villages empty? And then, they're talking about famine. The villages are empty because everybody has died because of these ghastly colonial famines. And so I'm very influenced by these aspects, and I try to liberate them in the novel, even when I was talking about very actual historical events like the partition, like the Bhopal, the Union Carbide disaster, or like the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857.
While reading Twilight Prisoners, I was particularly drawn to the section on the myths and visions of a Hindu utopia constructed by Hindu nationalists. For example, looking at Hindurite fantasies of ancient Indian technology, like the Vedic aircrafts, that also finds reference in your novel. So, could you tell us about the Hindurites' exploitation of modern technologies, media, market forces, and the project of myth-making that's become so widespread since Modi came to power?
Absolutely. I mean, fantasy, especially about a mythical past, an idealized mythical past, is like the starting terrain of all fascisms, all nationalism, right-wing nationalisms. The Nazis were into it in a huge way. The same is true of the Italian fascists. The same is true of, contemporary right-wing nationalisms, every Hindu right, not just the Hindu right. And that's because, it's very simple. They imagine a world where in the past, where they were the dominant power, it's perfect in its hierarchies of gender, caste. They're very patriarchal visions. The women are all beautiful, quote unquote, and the men are all strong, quote unquote, and there is no variation. And everybody else is like just these happy peasantry or subalterns, right? And you have, so I find that quite fascinating as a reporter, as a nonfiction writer. And you see that in Ayodhya, where, when you ask people to describe what did the Ram Rajya look like, they're describing these really banal visions of giant, maybe flying temples and lots of gold. There's always lots of gold, and jewelry. And this is something that obviously the rise of mass media, allows for the circulation of such myths very rapidly. Social media allows it even more. The Vimanas are part of it. We've seen it in the way Bollywood has seized upon it, in the way, it circulated as memes, And of course, there's a huge sort of, proliferation of right-wing fantasy books in India, which are books about Shiva and but they are all very much from the present. They are fantasies of a mythical past from the present. So they carry their own present hierarchies and desires with it, which are casteist, which are sexist, which are racist, which are Hindu fascist, basically, And, there are variations of this everywhere in the world, in the US as well, actually. It has its own white nationalists and versions of these. But, so I write about it very critically in my nonfiction, and in the Twilight Prisoners, I have a whole essay on Vimana. But then I'm also a fiction writer, so I'm also quite fascinated by this project of building imaginary worlds that's going on. And I don't understand why the left should just allow the right to seize on fantasy. Because one of the things that I find really troubling about the left today in India, and even elsewhere, the activists, these are my comrades, people I'm one with, is that people are often very boring. It's a lot about facts and figures. And yes, the facts and figures are important. They're very, very important. But, human beings are not just built on facts and figures. Emotions, myths, fantasies, desires, fears play a very, very large role in our state of being. And so, in some sense, the project of the novel was to seize, take the fantasy or the myth-making or world-building and turn it into something else, turn it into much more left-wing, radical, utopian. So even the Vimana that shows up in the novel isn't a right-wing Vimana. It could be. I mean, it has tendencies, but it's kind of built. It's like this slightly, it's influenced by the ideas, the Theosophists, and it's this sort of strange committee. It's meant to be a Vimana for peace, and I'm not entirely sure that I'm. And the novel is quite multi-layered, though. So even though it is meant to be a Vimana for peace, there is always a question. Is it actually, or is it also just ultimately going to become a super weapon? The story of Das in that novella is his journey towards that kind of understanding. And then, of course, it has to be read in context with the other sections of the novel. And then the Vimana becomes maybe a kind of super weapon, basically. So there's a lot of, like I said, playfulness, but it's not a straight on. I mean, my novel isn't, it's very, very critical of Hindu-fascism, of capitalism, of neoliberalism, of climate collapse. But I didn't want to feel like a worthy read. It's not meant to be polemical. It's a novel. It's meant to be imaginative. It's meant to go there in this imaginative, playful way. And so the whole idea, I find it sad and troubling that fantasy is, it's either the terrain of the right or it's the terrain of market capitalism. There's a kind of liberal version of it as well, which I don't like either. I don't see why the left or the radical, the progressive, people who hope for a better world can't remake myths, can't remake worlds for their own purposes. And again, I mentioned something like Afrofuturism. I feel Afrofuturism at its best does that. It radicalizes the project. It liberates the fantasy from the realm of right-wing forces. And in some sense, that's the conversation that is taking place between the novel and the nonfiction book.
Thank you, Siddhartha. Before we welcome you to present 2 short readings from your books, I'd like to take a moment to invite our listeners to check out our Patreon program and to support Himal's independent journalism, including some of the most wide-ranging book reviews from around the region that relies on the support of our listeners like you. Southasia Review of Books is a podcast and a monthly newsletter that threads together our latest reviews and literary interviews. You'll find a special reading list curated by Siddhartha Deb in this month's edition, so do sign up for the newsletter to keep up with our latest reviews, podcasts, and more. Now, Siddhartha, over to you to read 2 short excerpts from Twilight Prisoners and The Light at the End of the World.
Thank you, Shwetha. I will read from the novel first, The Light at the End of the World, and it's about a quarter of the way through the book, about 100 pages in. And we are in Delhi, and we are with the main character, who is Bibi, who is the former journalist. The summer heat is trapped between earth and grey haze. A still layer of moisture sits on Bibi's skin, present just at the pores, her body like parched soil being forced to relinquish every last drop of fluid. Sleepless, she sits at the back door of the flat with a pack of cigarettes, exhaling into the still air, tapping ash onto exposed rebar. Sanjit's face shimmering in her mind and churning her restless sleep until she explodes into wakefulness at this witching hour. In the morning, the sky presses down upon her. It attempts to iron out the kinks in her character, erase the questions she is trying to form as she pulls up his face on the screen, expanded and isolated into a still from Mohinder's video. Bibi can't find Mohinder. He doesn't respond to her calls and messages, and he is not to be seen at Amidala. There is talk of Amidala being shut down, and it is not clear whether Mohinder has been fired or if he has simply stopped coming to work. Bibi asks Akanksha if she has Mohinder's address. The receptionist nails a bit into the roots, and her eyes brimmed with sleeplessness. In a sudden burst of confidence, she shows Bibi her drawings. Eyes, limbs, wings faintly discernible through swirling smoke and wired netting. She has been having visions in her dreams, she says. Bibi gets in touch with people who knew Sanjit. They ask her where she has been all these years, tell her of the things she has missed. Has she been keeping track of the arrests? Does she know how many people have been lynched? How many other than Sanjit are dead? Her interviewees listen to her questions about Amidala, the farmhouse people, the video. Sometimes they offer her an additional detail, a new name or two, tracing faint outlines around the man who is both arms dealer and agent of the deep state, close to the government that wants a superweapon, and to the companies building that weapon. Always, they ask her to be careful. That is an excerpt from The Light at the End of the World. And now I will switch to an excerpt from Twilight Prisoners. And this is from the first chapter of the book, which was published originally in 2016. And it is called Nowhere Man, The Violence, Rage, and Insecurity of Narendra Modi. As in the 2002 massacres and their aftermath, the degree of violence under Modi's rule differs depending on the target. In the case of Muhammad Akhlaq, a Muslim man lynched in September on the suspicion of eating beef, it was a mob at the door with swords and pistols. When a group of writers returned the national awards they had received in protest at the Modi government's sectarianism, a Bollywood actor led a march against these writers for having hurt the spirit of India, ending with a much publicized meeting with Modi. Against this backdrop, with violence piling up almost faster than can be recorded, Modi has functioned as a talking mask. His performance is a banal kind of greatness, calibrated finely over a decade, even as behind and around him, violence moves in ranks that make it hard to tell the difference between the mob and the police. Yet the authoritarian personality of Modi would be without impact, without significance, if it did not resonate with the millions of authoritarian personalities among the professionalized classes in India and the diaspora, in Silicon Valley and New Jersey and Mumbai and Delhi, among those who have risen so suddenly as to be suffering from vertigo, who feel liberated from all meaningful knowledge, whether from the past or the present, and who feel enslaved by their liberation. While they harness their souls to the standards of professional, material, westernized success, to the air conditioning that Modi mocks when on the campaign trail, their insecurity and humiliation about the West makes them extract sustenance from Modi's utterances about Hindus having invented plastic surgery. From this hollowed-out form of success, bereft of love, spirituality, and justice, meaning can only emerge from banality and hatred. Modi's contradictions and lies channel the confusions of his supporters perfectly, in a manner reminiscent of the vanguards of China's Cultural Revolution, or the nativists flocking to Donald Trump. They accuse the old elites of holding back the nation and the culture from true greatness. They attack those responsible for the ruined past, the uncertain future, and the endless present. They assail the anti-nationals who stand in their way, beating and molesting people while shouting, Bharat Mata Ki Jai. They demand people say it to prove they are not traitors. They hammer with swords and guns and smartphones and double-digit growth at the doors of the beefeaters, the environmentalists, the university students, the feminists, the Dalits, the leftists, the dissenting writers, the skeptics, the anti-nationals, anyone who will not declare, both fists clenched, Bharat Mata Ki Jai. They have a rage that must burn itself out. And all that stands between them and the ashes of their rage is the astonishing, amazing phenomenon of a world that can still produce, from the crushed bottom layers of Indian society, people who, with every bit of the dignity and courage they can muster, resist the lure of their silent, lonely, aloof, admired, and unloved leader.
Thank you so much for this great reading, Siddhartha. Thank you. Going back to The Light at the End of the World, the novel presents 4 key moments in India's history, set in 4 different places. We go from a dystopian near-future Delhi to the Bhopal of 1984, to 1947 in Calcutta, the year of partition and India's independence, and the 4th and final section takes us to 1859, the Himalayas in the year of the Sepoy Mutiny. While taking from real historical incidents, the novel unsettles neat and linear ways of looking at India's modern history. So could you tell us about your approach to writing histories this way? How do you fictionalize real incidents while staying true to the tragedy of these events?
Thank you, Shwetha. It was a complex process. It took a while. I knew that I was interested in these moments. I knew, in some sense, I was pained by these moments. And for me, 1947 is the year of partition. It's not even the year of independence. It's the year that my father became a refugee. And in some sense, that status has haunted us, or me. And so, they are, and then Bhopal is, again, it's a place, the Union Carbide, it's a place that I've written about in nonfiction. When I was there on the 30th anniversary, I became very close friends with Abdul Jabbar, who was one of the amazing organizers who continued to fight and resist there in the decades after the disaster and the fallout. Sepoy Rebellion, I read about it for my work in my graduate school at Columbia. So I've always, and then of course the present. But so I've always been in history, but there are great historical novels about the Sepoy Rebellion, about the partition. There isn't very much about the Bhopal, which says something about our time and how, we are influenced by, what we think is important, right? But I knew I didn't want to do it with strict realism because, as I said, it felt like it couldn't quite capture the ghastliness of the experience for me as a writer. But also as a writer, I wanted to do something new. I wanted to do something different. I wanted to break from the terrain of not just Indian writing in English, but a lot of South Asian writing in English. And, whether from India or Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. And then when the novel comes out, people tell you a lot of these other books that are doing this very new books, which are doing similar things. So clearly, I'm not the only writer who's begun to feel this. I'm not the only writer who's doing this. There are other writers, again, in South Asia who have begun to step away, I think for similar reasons. But yeah, I wanted to play with it. I was playing with a kind of the counterfactual, speculative fiction. In Bhopal, I when I was reporting, people would say, people have these conspiracy theories. There are two kinds of conspiracy theories. The elite conspiracy theory was, this is completely made up. The poor they just try to extract free health care forever. I had no empathy, sympathy, interest in that particular conspiracy theory. That's the one that would probably dominate India's media today. The poor had a different conspiracy narrative. They said this was not accident, sir. It was an experiment done on us. And, it's easy to laugh at it from this sort of bourgeois perspective. But on the one hand, it seemed to be a very, very, very perceptive take. And to me, as a writer, as a fiction writer, it appealed to me. And I was like, what if you wrote a Bhopal novella where it was actually an experiment? It wasn't just an accident gone wrong, which is what I've written about in nonfiction. And there were this whole, sort of ethical quandaries, like, should I write about an actual historical event and turn it into a counterfactual? And I asked myself that question. And I asked my friend Abdul Jabbar that question. And Abdul Jabbar said, "Aap likhiye." He said, "Go." He gave me permission. And, Abdul Jabbar sadly died very young. But, I asked myself that question. And I said, I have written about it in nonfiction in very matter-of-fact way. And nobody still cares. There is no HBO show called Bhopal. There never will be. So I am going to write. Everybody talks about Chernobyl and Fukushima. And I'm sorry, I had to say, is it just because the people who died were poor and brown-skinned? And I think, yes. And I think even the Indian elite don't care about that. So I said, I gave myself ethical permission to tackle it in a kind of counterfactual way and say, okay, what if you wrote about it as if it was an experiment? And not just an experiment by the US multinational and the US government, but even the Indian government is kind of part. This is so I have always critiqued the government, and the idea of Indian nationalism. Similarly with the Sepoy Rebellion, just like there was this quote it's an actual historical quote from, Elgin, who has this amazing quote where he says, his Indian servants, he can't react to them because they are servants and they are Indians. He can communicate more with his dogs. And he wrote in his letter, and he's like, he wasn't some evil person. I'm not, this is the way imperialism thinks. This is what we see today in the way the Muslims are depicted, in the way Palestinians are depicted as animals. This has been going on, or worse than animals. But, Elgin was like, Indians are not even animals. They're worse than dogs. What if they're like automatons? They're like machines. And I was like, what if you wrote a Sepoy Rebellion story where some of the natives were actually machines? Nobody's done that. So there is a whole also spirit of playfulness in my fiction writing. And, otherwise you cannot spend 7 years working on a novel if it feels like drudgery. that would be terrible. So there is a part. Yes, the September Rebellion is really ghastly, and it was ghastly in the ways that we haven't even really absorbed fully. The way the partition was ghastly, we haven't really absorbed it because our nationalist histories are very, very, very fake. And this is true even before the Hindu right, actually. The Hindu right has just made it worse. But I said nobody has done it. So why not write a novella where some of the sepoys are actually machines? Who says a machine can't feel? So, and then with the near future, I wanted to set it to be a slightly alternative near future Delhi. Again, I wanted to play with that. I was like, okay, let's make it like a place where the dust storms are actually perhaps, maybe, you need to read the novel to find out, those who have it. But maybe they are not just like these, maybe they are a little bit alive. Maybe they are something else. Maybe they are something we can't comprehend with our, horrible, limited, these enlightenment, rationalist, consumerist minds. And so, and the ghost stories, I talked about the Bengali folk ghost stories that I grew up reading. They worked their way back into the BB novel. So it's like, what if one of the characters is maybe not entirely a human character? Seems to be human for a long time. But I had great fun writing it. I mean, I have to say, it was often very hard, but it's challenging because you're doing something new. But, I knew I was doing something difficult and different, but it felt very playful, and I enjoyed that part of it.
And I had great fun reading it, so thank you for that.
And it was wonderful to hear.
So, Siddhartha, when Modi first came to power, a section of India's mainstream liberal elite were willing to turn a blind eye to his undemocratic politics. They were holding out hope for some kind of economic boom, a dream which you could say has now collapsed, and we talked about this in the beginning of our conversation as well. So, could you tell us about the state of non-fiction writing in contemporary India, and where the crisis of Modi's liberal intellectual advocates stands today?
Well, his liberal advocates have remade themselves very swiftly into Modi critics. They've actually airbrushed their record from the internet. I know this because when the Modi essay was written in 2016, I named some of these liberals, and one of them at least attacked me on Twitter and talked about Ashutosh Varshney. He attacked me on Twitter saying that he called me a lot of names, a lot of very abstract academic names, like I think he was saying I need to be more educated, which is such a typical Brahminical casteist slur that Indians use all the time. But, I don't write about Modi as an academic. I'm not an academic. I write about these things as a journalist. But, I had carefully covered Modi's campaign trails. And he's like, so he said, no, Modi only made promises about good governance. He didn't do any of his usual hate-mongering campaigns. And then I gave him the clips he said, these are outliers. They don't actually, they're just like extreme examples. So I think and one of the best pieces you can read on the culpability of Modi's is by my excellent friend and colleague Praveen Donti, who was then a journalist for the Caravan. Praveen Donti has an excellent piece on the liberals who kind of brownwashed Modi during that time. It's for the record. Now the thing is, when I was writing in 2016, I had no grounds for hope that things will change. I didn't feel hope. I felt only despair. But I said, I am recording a history of the present, and it is important to do that. And that's what I was doing. I wasn't uncovering anything new, but people had already started changing the narrative of even 2002. People had started saying things like, the Supreme Court has given him a clean chit. And I was like, no, this is what happened, then this is what happened, then this is what happened, and this is what happened. Now people have begun to airbrush it. But the reason that the liberals supported Modi, and they call it good, for the new India, because they hate the poor. They hate the masses. They are really attached to neoliberalism. Now they may not be attached to the Hindu right project, but they are still attached to the nationalist, the neoliberalist, and the marketplace. And I criticized the marketplace and India's approach to neoliberalism before the Hindu right came to power. The Beautiful and the Damned is set mostly in the Congress years. It's reported mostly in the years when the Congress was the national party. it's a reported critique. You go to the agricultural areas, you see what is happening to the farmers. People would sit in Delhi and Bombay and pontificate about farmers using smartphones to get the latest cash prices for their crops. This is what the new market, the new India has given them. And then I went to the farmers, and and I asked them, and they laughed. Everybody laughed. The rich farmers, the medium farmers, and the landless sharecroppers, which is the bulk. I think there is there's also kind of a colonial humiliation, kind of self. We want to be like like Singapore. We want to be like the West, like London or New York. That is true whether you're a liberal or whether you're a Hindu nationalist. I don't think any society should be like any other, especially these colonial, imperial, violent entities that are seemingly materially successful because they are built on 400 years of plunder and violence, basically. I don't see why anyone should aspire to that. But that's what the liberals did. Now they're airbrushing because India is a disaster economically. We can see that. It is the everyday life. We saw that during the pandemic, which people again forget very carefully. We saw that in the horrific response to the pandemic. And I think the two worst responses I can think of for the United States under Trump and India under Modi. And it was like human life has no value. And of course, we've known this for a long time. But, you're still shocking it that there is no plan. There is no public health. In India, public health is so bad. Women's health is so bad. I mean, these things we need to talk about. It's not enough to talk about this growth that, the economists constantly, that's what they were praising Modi about, even when they were critiquing their, authoritarianism or their sectarianism. It's like growth. What does growth mean? There's just more air conditioning and more new airports, and it looks all shiny, but they still get flooded every summer when it rains because it's all shoddy construction made by these few oligarchic companies, which can't even do a construction job properly and don't pay their construction workers properly. So, it's a joke, the whole boom. Yes, some people have been immensely enriched. And we know that. What was it? The new, just before the elections, the data that India under Modi is more unequal than India under British colonialism. That is what we have achieved. And that has been made possible not just by the Hindu right, but by the neoliberals and the liberals who, were these evangelists for American-style neoliberalism.
Thank you, Siddhartha. That was really well said. And that brings me to our last question of the episode. I absolutely loved the playlist you curated for book notes on The Light at the End of the World, and I had a lot of fun listening to that as I was reading the book. So it's a playlist for the end of the world from the subcontinent from Bibi's view, the main character in the novel, who listens to music as she makes her way through near-future Delhi. So we'd love to get your reading recommendations for fiction and non-fiction that reflect the same strangeness of our times and India's current political moment.
Sure. I'm so glad you brought up the playlist. I hope other people check out the essay on the playlist and listen to the songs. There are gaps. They're led by Bibi's listening habits, and she listens to a lot of songs from Pakistan and Bangladesh. There's not very much. There's, I think, zero representation of songs from the South, which is really terrible. That's not true for me, though. I mean, I listen to quite a lot of Carnatic music, actually. I listen to a lot of music, and one of my favorite composers is A.R. Rahman. So, just to talk about both the popular and the high end of it. But yeah, I do listen to a lot of Bengali, Baul, and a lot of Sufi music from both sides, Punjab, both sides of the border. But yeah, I would love it if people check that out. In terms of reading lists, yes. So in terms of novels, in terms of fiction, not just novels, I would mention Devika Rege's Quarter Life, which has received a lot of attention recently. I would definitely mention Anjum Hassan's History's Angel, these all came out the same time as my novel. And I want to mention a collection of stories, which is slightly older, by the Kashmiri writer Firoz Arathar. He's my friend. They're all three are my friends. So, they're all three I got, I've known them different periods of time. But Firoz Rather's The Night of Broken Glass, which is a collection of stories set in Kashmir. So I would recommend these three in terms of fiction. In terms of non-fiction, I would say Akshay Mukul's book, Gita Press and the Making of Hindu India, is a kind of must-read for understanding the current political moment. I would also mention Dhirendra Jha's book on biography of Nathuram Godse. And the third book, it's slightly older again, but and Gita Press and the Making of Hindu India is also, I think, came out a few years ago. But the third nonfiction book, which I think is a must-read, is Sujata Gidla's Ants Among Elephants, which is a kind of memoir, but also a kind of incredible social history of the Dalit experience, the Indian left, but also of Indian history. And it's I think it's seen as a memoir because it is very much a personal story, but it is also an incredible intellectual history of the past of India, and and also a political primer in a way. So I would mention these three books as in the nonfiction as must read. I could go on. There are a lot of other good books, but I think these are good starting points.
Siddhartha, thank you again for an excellent discussion and those excellent reading recommendations as well. Really excited to pick up all of those books. And thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. It was a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Yes, Shwetha, thank you so much for your lovely questions. I'm really glad you enjoyed the book. I also wanted to say I really admire Himal. I have known Himal from the time they started. So I'm so glad that Himal exists. And I'm so glad that we have it allows for a kind of a non-nationalist, but a larger sense of global South identity. It's one of the things that pleases me most about it. So yes, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Really glad to hear that. Thank you so much, Siddhartha. Thank you for listening to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal Southasian. This episode was edited by Ritika Chauhan. If you like this episode, please share widely, rate, review, subscribe, and download the show on your favorite podcast apps. You can find Siddhartha Deb's reading list for the episode in this month's Southasia Review of Books newsletter. You can find the links to subscribe and listen to previous episodes on our website at himalmag.com. What we do and what we love doing at Himal is really looking at South Asia like no other, and that gives us a very unique community viewpoint and the privilege of making conversations like this possible. So if you'd like to help us out, please do become a Himal member. We have a great program with lots of perks, including Himal's iconic right side up map, and we'll welcome you to a fantastic community. Thanks again, and until next time.